It's just a science project.
Silent breed is people!
You know, a doctor friend once said the same thing to me. Frankenstein was his name.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
That sounds like something out of science fiction.
Please explain to me the scientific nature of the whammy.
We live in a spaceship, dear. So?
Yes, science!
Program complete. Enter when ready.
Hello and welcome to episode 318 of Science on Top. Today is Sunday the 25th of November 2018. I'm Ed Brown and I'm joined by Penny Dumsday.
Hello.
And Lucas Randall.
Hello.
And a reminder that not long ago we lost a very good friend and listener to the show, Penelope Green. And in her memory, we are donating all the Patreon contributions that we get for this episode and the next 9 to two of her preferred charities, the Fred Hollows Foundation and Doctors Without Borders. So if you want to be a part of that and help us out, go to scienceontop.com/donate. That's very much appreciated. But let's start the show. And Penny, it's one of my favourite stories of the week already because it's about wombats. The cute, lumbering, fat-assed Australian marsupials. And one of the stranger things about them is their poop. It's the only animal, at least that I can think of, that does cubed poops. Stackable poop blocks. And it could be that we've finally figured out how it poops square blocks. Because it has a round anus, so you'd expect round poops.
Poo.
How does it poop in squares?
I think before we get to the how, we might just mention the why. I think a lot of Australian kids who go bushwalking have probably, noticed wombat poo, and it is really square. I remember my cousins and I used to have a song about it, which I won't sing, but
After the show.
After the show, perhaps after like several drinks, but apparently this square poo actually has a benefit in that it's used as a territorial marker, and one of the great things about squares as opposed to round pellets is that it doesn't tend to roll away.
And you don't normally want your poo to roll away? Is poo on your doorstep a good thing?
Well, if you're using it to say, this is mine, and this is mine, and this is mine, and this is where I live, and this is where I do my poo, my lovely square poo. I guess in a way, like a cow pat shaped ploppy poo could equally not roll away. But I'm not a
well, then you also get
poo
moisture
biologist
in that. So if you're in the dry Australian outback, you want to preserve all the water you can.
Preserve your moisture
so the drier the
and
food,
mark your territory.
Exactly.
Anyway, but how do they do it? Because as Ed said, they've got a round anus, just like other mammals. And how do they make this square poo? Because at the moment, we've only really got industrially like 2 ways of making squares. You can sort of mold it in a square thing or cut bits off to make a square. So how does one do that in a very squishy biological situation? And also apparently wombats can pass up to 100 of these a night.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
How big are we talking, though? Because they're like 2 centimetre wide, aren't they? Sort of.
Yeah, they're quite
so about an inch
cubed.
cubed.
Yeah, I think of them as like a kid's building block, sort of so they're bigger than a dice. But how do they do it? The obvious place to do that is to look at the animal's intestine. And I've always been fascinated by sort of comparative studies of intestines because the size and shape of different parts of the intestine gives such huge clues to an animal's diet and, the way that it processes its food. So if you look at for one extreme example of a vampire bat, it essentially is just a little smooth tube that goes right through it because it's eating blood, which is essentially just ready-made to go in and be used. Whereas if you look at something like a cow that is eating grass, it has all these chambers and bits and pieces and places for things to go. And a human's digestive system, we eat a bit of everything, is kind of in between.
Including the cow.
The cow, but not so much the vampire bat.
No.
So the researchers had a look at the digestive tracts of wombats that had been euthanized after being struck by cars, which is wombats being little slow-moving balls of muscle, unfortunately, they do often become roadkill. And what they found was that the excrement kind of solidifies in the last little bit of the intestine where the feces kind of builds up into blocks. But how did it get to that place? And what they found when blowing up the intestines by like a long modelling balloon, so the sort that you'd see at a kid's party being used to make a balloon animal, they use that to blow up the intestine and have a look at it. And what they found is that unlike the rest of the intestine, that special bit doesn't stretch evenly. So bits of it are more stiff than others. So it kind of goes stiff, soft. And what this means is as the wombat strains and pushes, the stiff regions form the flat faces and the stretchier parts let the corners form. So the actual specifics of this haven't been discovered yet because it's thought that it might need to be modelled with a bit more strain, i.e. a larger balloon, to see, because there's only been 3 stretchy bits found. But the idea is that this movement through stretch, stiff, is what gives the cube its shape.
That's really interesting because when you think about it, as you say, we have previously known of 2 ways of making a cube. You either have it in a mould or you cut things away until it's a cube. Now it's a third, and I'm sort of thinking you could almost use this, I don't know why you'd ever want to, but in a manufacturing process, if you ever need to make cubes, you could do a stretching moulding. In fact, that's probably the next stage of investigation, is to see if we can replicate it using
with some
machinery
kind of
or
artificial
something.
gut or
Just imagine having that as an engineer, having that.
Oh, I know.
Oh, what are you working on now? I'm making an artificial wombat's anus. It's
that's really commercially important. It's funny though, like, do you know, all the time, for all the years I've known about wombat poo, I have never once wondered how. I was just like, oh yeah, it's square. Of course. Moving on.
Yeah.
You know?
It's not the sort of thing that makes you think, but do they have square anuses? I don't
never
know.
thought, I would never have, I guess that says more about my lack of kind of imagination. I just never would have...
your lack of interest in anus.
Lack of interest in wombat anuses.
You have a healthy lack of interest in anus.
Very good. No, I also, again, I just love it when we find out a mystery about something that might be as somewhat, obscure or, boring almost, but it's just that little bit of information of, I would never have thought of that.
Well, my kids have asked me about this in the past, and I did not have an answer for them. So now at least I can tell them the current thinking. Yeah.
Hey, kids, remember 5 years ago you asked me, right?
Yeah, in the car that time we were driving down the street.
All right. Well, Lucas, our son has kind of grown up as an only child. We've thought of it as being all alone with no siblings to play with. But now, like a Targaryen dragon mother who's just discovered a long-lost Stark nephew, spoiler alert, it turns out our son has a twin sister. Where's our son's twin?
In space. It's out there. It's about 184 light years from Earth at this time. It's moving, as they all are, and it's called... It's got a nice name. It's HD 186302 or 302. I know. It rolls off the tongue. It's just cute. So backtracking just for a moment. There's actually a collaborative project that specifically is looking for other stars that likely formed with our sun. So stars form in stellar nurseries, right? There's just like great big clouds of gas, which, depending on at what point in the evolution of a galaxy and the age of the universe, those clouds of gas will have originally would have just been hydrogen, and then over time they would have built up to heavier and heavier elements. So these clouds and the reason they would have built up, of course, is because the early generation stars would have been really, really big, and then they would have exploded in a fiery death, and they would have thrown their heavier elements out, and then they in turn became the gas clouds for the next generations of stars, and so on and so forth up to where we are now. So we do know that our star would have formed in a stellar nursery, and in fact we have previously found one of its siblings, just one of them, a couple of years ago, I think. I can't remember exactly when that was. So we have found one before, but what's very interesting about this particular star is that its signature and its mass make it almost a twin to our sun, and that is
what do you mean
really
by its
interesting.
signature?
So it's chemical makeup. The ratios of the elements in the star, its age and its size and mass. These things are basically make it a complete twin to ours. So we know, and this project that I mentioned before, which is called the Amber Project. Its purpose is to find stars that meet the criteria, the first criteria of the similarity of makeup, and in all likelihood they formed in the same stellar nursery as ours. So what tends to happen is after stars form in their stellar nursery, the gravitational forces of the galaxy kind of spread them all around the place. So it's not unusual that this thing is way out 100 and plus light years from where we are now, 184 light years. Because I initially thought, well, that's weird because we've got stars much closer to us than that. Why is it so far away? And then you've got to remember, well, we're talking over 4.6 billion years here of time elapsed since they formed to now. That's a long time for them to kind of get mixed up and tossed around and so on and so forth in the great big blender that's the Milky Way. Plus we've had galactic mergers, as the Milky Way has gobbled up other galaxies, and these things all these interactions toss stuff about. So this star, this HD 186302, is, if you consider that it is a very similar makeup to ours, we don't know whether it has planets around it, but we can, for the sake of argument, probably assume that it does, right? Because that's what we're tending to find is pretty much every damn star has got things around it. So that's becoming the norm. But our star is really abnormal. It's actually a lot bigger than most stars, and you don't think of it because it's tiny compared to the red supergiants and the blue giants and all the other giants that are out there. Ours is really quite minuscule compared to them, but it's still bigger than 80% of stars that are out there.
Oh, wow.
Or some other percentage. So it's quite unique. It's not unique. I'm just talking about its twin, but it's not usual. It's abnormal. Just the size of our star is actually on the much bigger end than most of the stars out there. Vast majority of stars out there are sort of red dwarfs and those sorts of things, or much smaller than ours. So it's really interesting to find one that not just has the same spectra and therefore it's made of the same stuff, which means it came from the same cloud, but also it's a very, very similar mass. It's only just slightly more massive than ours. So if it does have planets, which would have formed from the same cloud as the star, just as ours did, just as Earth did, if you extrapolate out and go, okay, well, we're finding fossil evidence that life on Earth seems to have come about pretty early, and it seems to be getting earlier and earlier and earlier. We did a story just the other week on this. It's entirely within the realms of possibility that if life started on Earth first, or indeed one of the other planets in one of our sister stars first, that there could have been some, sort of panspermia type interactions between them during the period of bombardment, because there was just so much stuff flying around, and the gravitational interactions as the planets were clearing out their orbits around each of the stars in this sibling group, we could have even been trading planets. I mean, I just love thinking about that.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a pretty big deal to think about. So this is exciting. there will be others out there, and as I said, this whole project is this Amber project is about finding the other siblings, and there'll be more. We can take it for granted there'll be more. The question will be how many of them will be this identical, because it's really lucky that this was just the second one to find that we found with the project. So yeah, really cool.
And to be clear, we haven't found any planet around it yet.
Correct.
Right.
Yep. Haven't found a planet.
That is an intriguing thought, though, that 4 billion years ago, the two accretion disks of our respective suns would have been quite close together, and if they would have formed planets, yeah, it is possible that a planet from that other sun may have come to ours or vice versa and mixed around, which, I mean, because we always think about, when we look at comets or asteroids or Kuiper belt objects, they are the building blocks of our solar system and everything. They're not necessarily. They could be the building blocks of another solar system that formed at the same time. I had never thought of it like that, and I think that's a very cool line of thought.
Well, especially since, we've talked about multi-body interactions before with planets and moons and so forth. Once you throw multiple bodies in there, it can become unstable really, really quickly, and you can eject planets. You can eject whole planets. That's why there's rogue planets. So that it's certainly within the realms of possibility that that life, if it had evolved as early enough, could have ended up in multiple systems that were all sort of came from the same place. So, yeah.
Mind blown. That is really cool. Well, let's now look at taxonomy, which is
your favourite.
My favourite. It is a little bit confusing because there's lots of different systems that are used in different countries and over different time that's been refined. But basically, we're talking about how we classify life, whether it's animals, whether it's bacteria, fungi, and all of that. Do you want to give us a quick summary of how taxonomy works in the mainstream, and then talk about this bizarre new group that could be a new domain of life, a new kingdom of life, sorry.
Yeah, so I think most people at sort of year 7, and I'm saying this from my professional experience as a science teacher, at least most Australian kids would be learning about the 5 kingdoms. So 3 of those kingdoms most people are pretty familiar with: animals, plants, and fungi. There's 2 more kingdoms, and the other one is Protista. And together with the animals, plants, and fungi, we can lump all these kingdoms together and say they're pretty similar. They're all, in terms of similar, like you and a fungus, like just twinsies, but you all have what we call eukaryotic cells. So they all have like internal membranes and a nucleus. The other kingdom is called Monera, and that is the one which has the bacteria in it. They're much more, I'm going to say, primitive cells, but that doesn't mean that they, evolved a couple of billion years ago and didn't change. They're still changing. They just don't have that complex internal structure that eukaryotic cells do. So when we actually started to look at bacteria in more detail, we found out that there's different groups of bacteria which are so different from each other that it does actually make us look the same as a plant or a fungus, because we are so similar compared to these bacteria groups which are different. So you can superimpose on those 5 kingdoms 3 domains. You've got your bacteria, your archaebacteria, which are all the weird and wonderful ones, and the eukarya. So we're going to focus on the eukarya and the 5 kingdoms. And the 5 kingdoms, I have always felt, is sort of a relic, like Ed said, of like a previous understanding. So, there's that old game where you classify things as animal, vegetable, or mineral. Now, I'm not going to go into the huge details of like why a fungus is not a plant, but it does grind my gears when I read a kid's book that talks about fungi being plants, because, but anyway, whatever. I just do my own little editing as I read. But essentially, plants make their own food and fungi don't. So animal, plant, fungi are reasonably not intuitive. They fit together kind of well. They're things that we're familiar with and we can observe. There's a few little outliers here and there, but on the whole, we can all agree on a set of traits that define something as an animal, a plant, or a fungus. Mm-hmm. The last kingdom of eukaryotes, which is called the Protista, is a bit more of a grab bag. So you've got things in there like paramecium, which are little single-celled organisms. They're definitely eukaryotes. They're definitely not multicellular like an animal, but, you know, they do eat other living things for food. You've also got things like algae, which in some ways are multicellular, like they're great big aggregations of cells living together, but they don't have the complex internal structures of plants. And some biologists will say algae are plants, some will say they're not. I feel that this will change back and forth. They've definitely got features in common with plants, blah, 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 blah. So, look, I really enjoy taxonomy. I cannot say I'm an expert on it. I'm certainly not an expert on the Protista. And this is what we're looking at now. It's a new kind of organism. It's so different from those other eukaryotes that it doesn't really fit into the plant or animal kingdom. It's kind of so different from other organisms that we would say we should group animals and fungi together. We do have a lot in common with fungi. We're heterotrophic. That means we eat other organisms or we get our energy from eating other organisms and so on. And we should group them together because we are so similar compared to how different they are from other organisms, if that makes sense. What's really cool about this is you wouldn't necessarily know by looking at them. These organisms are called, and I have never heard of them before, so I'm going to do my best, Hemimastigotes. And they're microscopic organisms. These particular ones were found in Nova Scotia. And they look like, they've been described as looking sort of like pistachio shells with little feelers coming out. They're interesting because they have little flagella, but they don't kind of organise the way they move. They sort of wave them in a random way. And one of the biologists says it's like they never really learned that they've got flagella. So this...
The flagella are like the little tail.
The little hairs or, yeah.
Right.
So this is what led them to recognise these as these Hemimastigotes. They were first seen and described in the 19th century, but obviously in the 19th century, they got things so right with just observation of traits, but they didn't have the benefit of DNA analysis. What is really, really cool is over the past 100 years, about 10 species of them have been described, and they are eukaryotes. They've got a nucleus. They've got chromosomes and DNA. They're definitely not bacteria. Is that because these ones have been found, they could be genetically analysed. And this is actually really cool because they were doing an analysis of one microbe. They figured out what it could eat. They kind of tamed it and were able to study it. And what they found on that genetic...
Sorry, did you say they tamed it?
So when I said tamed it, they could rear them in captivity. And Shane would be able to talk a lot better about this than I would. But one of the problems with studying microbes is like the ones we find are the ones we can grow. If you collect a sample and you spread it on a Petri dish and your little microbe goes, well, I hate Petri dishes, RIP, you wouldn't even know it was there. So figuring out how it likes to live is really important. And what they found by this genetic analysis is that they're so unique, they would actually be in their own kind of supra kingdom. So you would consider within that domain, I know there's so many levels of hierarchy, animals and fungi together, plants. I'm not going to get into protist taxonomy because I find it incredibly confusing. But yeah, they would be their own thing, which I think is really, really cool. It's like a little bit of evolutionary history that just happens to have kept evolving till today, a completely different chain of life. I think they suggested it would be in about maybe 500 million years since it had a common ancestor.
A billion,
billion
years,
years,
which is
yeah.
500 million years before the first animals
That's right.
or anything resembling an animal developed.
I knew it was a long time. Yeah, so this is a really, really ancient split off the eukaryote line, which I think is really cool. I'd never heard of these before. I love anything about taxonomy, especially eukaryotes rather than bacteria, because I know more about eukaryotes. Yeah.
Yeah. I just love it when we find things that are so different, things that we'd never seen before, sort of thing. And this is just, I mean, Shane has often spoken before about how there are billions of things that we have not even looked at because we can't grow it in a lab, tame it, as you say. We can't study it properly. And there's just so many things that we, may never learn about.
But you know what, though?
Never understand because we can't grow them.
I expect bacteria to be wacky. But
But they don't do cube poops, damn it.
Well, no, but in the scheme of things, a wombat's basically the same as you.
Exactly.
Anyway, but yeah, a wacky eukaryote is always fun.
I'm sure I've seen that on a t-shirt. Yes. Very good. Well, speaking of wacky, Lucas, there's another planet out in our galaxy that has water in its atmosphere, and we keep talking about this search for liquid water, and water vapor or water in an atmosphere is just as good in terms of raising the chances of finding life out there. So tell us about this watery planet.
Well, yeah, so it's not the first we've discovered with liquid water, but this in its atmosphere, I should say. But this planet's, I believe it's the second. I may be wrong on that, but that's certainly what my readings are indicated. This is a planet that lives in a system that's located about 179 light years away from us. It orbits a star called HR 8799. This star and its system is actually one of the first stars to have been for its planets to have been directly imaged. So it's already kind of quite a heavily studied star. This, I think, going back to it was about 2008 or so. I think they announced that they had directly imaged the planets around this star. So along with I think it was Fomalhaut B or something or other. Yeah, Fomalhaut. Yeah. So around, cast your mind back. It's one of those. So I think initially they discovered about 3 planets around it, and then they discovered another one a few years later, or 2 years later or so in 2010, another planet which brought it up to 4. So these planets, there's a very nice chance alignment of these planets, because planets tend to orbit on a plane. If you imagine just a big disk of gas that originally formed the star, that same disk of gas tends to form the planets that are around the star, and that's actually one of our definitions of planets and why Pluto got booted, because it's not actually on the plane. We call it the ecliptic, the plane that goes around the star. So in this particular case with HR 8799, it's edge on to us. So if you image it, it's like you're looking down or up at the star with the planets going around it. So it makes it possible to directly image it if you can block out the light, because obviously the star is really, really bright, and comparatively the planets are quite dim. And that was one of the big breakthroughs with the imaging of this star was using new techniques at the time to block out the light from the star so that you could actually see the planets going around it. And on Wikipedia, I'm just looking right now. There's a graphic there. It's an animated GIF. And I'm saying GIF because GIF is wrong. That's
agreed.
that shows several of I think there's 4 of them you can see in the image of these planets that are going around it. So that's its pedigree, and what's important about this one is, as I say, the fact that it was one of the first that we directly imaged, and the fact that we can directly image these planets, which just again to remind you, 170 plus light years away, directly imaging. Like that's photograph of, you know what I mean? That's mind-blowing.
I mean,
still mind-blowing. Even if it was 10 years ago.
It's a little pixel, but it's still a direct image of it.
Still, it's still an image. Yeah, absolutely. It's not just blips. It's not analyzing spectra. It's not using the radial velocity method to detect the wobble. All of these other techniques that we've used, direct imaging, dudes. I mean, this is fantastic. So the fact that we can directly image this one opens up some possibilities for us. And what has happened now using the Keck telescope, they've been able to use two of the instruments, the Keck 2 telescope specifically. There's two instruments that are a part of that particular telescope, which together have allowed them to confirm the existence of water vapor in the atmosphere, and also that there is not any methane evidence in this super Jupiter-sized, planet. So we're talking about a planet here that's about 7 times the mass of Jupiter. So this is not a rocky body by any stretch. This is a hot Jupiter. Actually, it might not be hot. It's orbits a star every 200 years, so it's not like it's really in close to it. But it's a big bertha. And using the adaptive optics of Keck 2, which allows it to overcome the twinkle of stars when you look at them in the sky. This is caused by just movement of air and other stuff that's up in our atmosphere. So it makes it really hard to do optical imaging from Earth, which is why the Hubble has been so successful, because it's above and beyond all of that. But Hubble itself is quite a small telescope. We've got much bigger telescopes on Earth because it's just easier to build really big mirrors and not have to launch them into space. So Keck is an amazing instrument. I won't go into Keck now, but read up on it if you're interested in it. But it does have these adaptive optics, which effectively make it in real time able to adjust for the atmospheric disturbances and the movement of air and other molecules that cause that twinkling of the stars. So the adaptive optics, along with another particular spectrometer which is mounted on this telescope, this spectrograph called the NIRSpec, which is a high-resolution spectrometer that works in the infrared light, specifically in the L band of infrared light. Now, L is interesting because the L band is very luminous and the sky is full of it. So it's normally not a great wavelength to work in unless you're Keck and you have you've got adaptive optics, which allows you to use the L band to collect a huge amount of data. It's just, and that was really the key for this finding. So as I said, it's in the infrared wavelength. It's about 3.5 micrometers or so, this particular wavelength of light, and it's really good for gathering spectra because we can get really detailed chemical footprints of these stars and planets in this case. So yeah, it's really the combination of instruments, and this is really what this instrument is for. Keck is doing what it was designed to do, and what the scientists have said about this, because as you mentioned in the intro there, Ed, that finding water vapor in an atmosphere is in of itself a pretty important step, because that's something that would definitely be an indicator for the potential for life on a planet that wasn't a super Jupiter. If this were an Earth type analog and we found water vapor in its atmosphere, that would be very encouraging.
Sure.
Because that's an indication that the temperatures are right. We're talking Goldilocks zone and all that sort of thing. That's also an indication of certain processes going on that would be very important for life as well. So in terms of the importance of this discovery, this particular Jupiter doesn't have any major, massive implications, but the fact that we've got technology now that is capable of doing this, and the technology itself is evolving very quickly. There's another telescope, which is a 30-meter telescope, which is planned in the next few years, and that's going to have bigger and better versions of this technology in it. So we could well be, getting to the point in not too distant future where we're able to directly image and look for water in the atmospheres of some of the Earth analogues that we've found, and that'll
big.
just be awesome. Yeah.
And just getting back to the planet, did you say something about it doesn't have any methane or it's lacking methane?
Yeah, so that was interesting too, because with a gas giant like Jupiter, methane is fairly abundant. So they're thinking that there's some processes in place here with this particular planet where they reckon methane would be there, but probably the convection currents and this incredibly complex gas system, just like our Jupiter, might be pulling the methane sort of into lower layers. Mm-hmm. And that's also interesting because that's not something that we've seen before. So obviously there's not a lot to go on at the moment, but there was a distinct lack of methane in the spectra for this planet.
Because I always thought, isn't methane something that we actually look for because that's usually an organic process that would indicate life if there's methane in the atmosphere? Or is that on rocky planets we would be looking for?
On rocky planets because methane is it doesn't like to hang around. Yep. But if you're a gas giant, there's a lot of gravity in play and there's a huge atmosphere in play as well. But with a rocky planet, it's a little bit more...
We'd expect any methane to escape.
Well, yeah, I mean, it needs to be replenished, basically. There needs to be a cycle of some sort that's replenishing it. So it is one of those indicators for potentially for biology, but there's also geological processes as well that can cause it. But also, things like oxygen in an atmosphere is definitely something that we want to know about because it doesn't hang around either. Oxygen really likes bonding to stuff. So it doesn't hang around in atmospheres unless it's being, held
in place.
Freed. Yep. Yeah, unless it's being liberated from its bonds with other things by things like plants, which are really good at doing that. So oxygen is something we'd really be interested in.
All right, I think that's our show. And as always, all the links we talked about are in the show notes and on the web at scienceontop.com/318. Don't forget to check out scienceontop.com/donate to become a Patreon. And starting this week, as I mentioned at the start, we'll be donating all the contributions for the next 10 episodes to Penelope Green's favourite charities. So thank you very much for your support there. And thanks for joining me today, Penny and Lucas.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Ed.
And thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back again next week, putting science on top of the agenda. Join us then.
I think the winner of the week's Booby Prize, though, would probably be CNN.
I think that's true. Rick Santorum was on CNN claiming scientists are in it for the money.
If there was no climate change, we'd have a lot of scientists looking for work. The reality is that a lot of these scientists are driven by the money that they receive.
The next day, we saw Tom DeLay, the former House Majority Leader.
The report is nothing more than a rehash of age-old 10 to 20-year assumptions made by scientists that get paid to further the politics of global warming.
He's the disgraced former House Majority Leader who had to resign after he was convicted of money laundering and conspiracy. Why is this guy qualified to discuss a scientific report about climate change? We saw Stephen Moore, a Trump-loving economist, making the same ridiculous claim on CNN.
Billions and billions and billions of dollars at stake. A lot of people are getting really, really, really rich off the climate change issue.
Then on Tuesday morning, John Avlon did a good segment on CNN where he completely debunked this notion that there's a big climate industrial complex and that scientists are just doing it to get rich.
Now, that talking point you're hearing is a classic bit of distraction and deflection. In fact, one of the scientists who worked on the climate change report, Catherine Hayhoe, confirms that she and her colleagues were paid, quote, $0 for their work. They could easily make 10 times their salaries by working for something like Big Oil.
But later that same day, on Tuesday, just hours after Avalon's fact-checking segment ran, CNN again had on Stephen Moore to make that same claim. And what was so frustrating about CNN having these climate deniers on to make ridiculous claims is they didn't disclose the fact that Rick Santorum and Tom DeLay, when they were in Congress, they got more than $700,000 each from the oil and gas industry in campaign contributions. Stephen Moore works for a number of groups that are funded by the Koch brothers. Last month, Stephen Moore gave a speech to the Oklahoma Oil and Gas Association. These things were not disclosed, but those men were allowed to accuse scientists of being in it for the money.